James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour, as always, to rise in this House and speak on behalf of the people of Timmins-James Bay, particularly on this important motion, the New Democrat motion about restoring the nation-to-nation relationship with First Nation people. I will be sharing my time with the member from Louis Saint Laurent. I think it is very important that this debate comes this week when we have numerous issues showing us the fundamental failure of Canadians to live up to that relationship. At Neskatanga, where we have this horrific suicide crisis, and Mr. Speaker, I've seen the suicide crisis in James Bay and the damage that they do psychologically, physically, and spiritually to people. I note that Neskatanga in English means Fort Hope, and it seems so ironic that a community so devastated was a place called Hope. That this week, 9 premiers came forward and asked this Conservative government for an inquiry into the hundreds and hundreds of murdered missing women, and the government continues to turn a deaf ear because in their eyes, perhaps there's one set of victims that they'll listen to, but the hundreds of missing First Nation young women across this country, they continue to stonewall. I think, Mr. Speaker, that this week, as the government continues its court case against Cindy Blackstock, they've spied on a woman who's speaking out on First Nation children, on the issue of education and child rights at a time when there's more children being held now in foster care and taken away from their families than at the residential school height. This shows you the broken relationship that we need to restore. I want to speak today, Mr. Speaker, about Treaty 9 because this is the region that I represent, the height of land in Northern Ontario. And there's a sense out there, I know in the media when we have the Attawabascat housing crisis and that, it's like, hey, we won, they lost. That seems to be the general public view of the treaty, that the treaty was some kind of surrender, a giving up. And yet, Mr. Speaker, until you understand the story of the treaty, you don't really understand why this relationship with First Nation people has gone so wrong. And you don't understand why people like Grand Chief Stan Looted and Chief Teresa Spence speak so much about Treaty 9. Their grandfathers signed that treaty. This is not ancient history. This is the beginning of what went wrong in the modern 20th century. If you look at the Indian Affairs website on Treaty 9, it's amazing. The very first line the Indian Affairs puts out for their history of Treaty 9 is, it begins with the opening statement to say, please come, we ask you to help us. As though the First Nations were hoping that the Indian Affairs bureaucrats were going to come up and make everything right. That what was being spoken about in the late 1800s was the incursion by the white settlers into First Nation lands, stripping the lands of their basic resources, and the attempt by the people to define some rules on the ground. They were not calling up Indian Affairs to come up and say, hey, come and take all our land and put us on a reserve. They were saying, our fundamental rights that we've never extinguished are under attack. They were under attack from the CP rail. They were under attack from the white settlers who were trying to basically flood the communities with alcohol while taking away the basic hunting rights. But it's interesting, it was also the issue of resource development. In December 1901, the Hudson Bay Company Osnaburg House forwarded a petition saying that, quote, for the past 2 or 3 years, exploration for minerals has been carried on in the country contiguous to Lake St. Joseph. They asked to meet with His Majesty's officials to discuss what was happening in terms of mineral exploration, quote, as white men are already building on land which we desire to maintain. In 1903, the Geological Survey of Canada was turned away by the chief of the Crane Band, who said they had no right to come and explore without the express consent of First Nations. Back in 1872, near Jackfish Lake, Chief Blackstone shut down gold development, saying they had no right to be there. So now we see, fast forward to the 21st century, where KI in northwestern Ontario kicked out that junior mining company that refused to consult or Waugashig First Nation in my area, where the company said, it's not our job to look for their Indian arrowheads. We're a mining exploration company. The refusal to consult today resulted in First Nations taking the same action that their ancestors took over 100 years ago. So when the treaty commissioners came forward, it was never about the surrender of land. It was about ensuring that the land was going to be used in a fair and equitable manner, which wasn't happening. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting. Indian Affairs actually, in their history, blames Ontario. and says that, quote, it was Ontario that had licensed the surveyors and the mining exploration parties that the Indians were complaining about to federal officials. And as the Cree and Ojibwe were later to discover, it was Ontario which had already given out the timber licenses to lands which they wanted to reserve for themselves. If the incursion of the whites was the gun pointed at the head of Indian people, Ontario's finger was on the trigger. That's the official history from the Indian Affairs point of view. Now, certainly, Mr. Speaker, we know that across the prairies, across Ontario, across Quebec, the provinces treated the First Nation people as non-existent. They were federal responsibility, hence they didn't exist. The province could do whatever they wanted. But in the case of Treaty 9, the issue was that they were trying to get some certainty on the land, and Ontario took the hard line. They said, we won't even allow a reserve to even have any kind of hydro development potential, period. They were going to get the land that was absolutely worthless. But the fact is, they didn't tell the people in Treaty 9. So when the commissioners came forward in 1905, 1906, across the upper lakes, they were making promises to the people. They were making oral promises, because this was not a written culture. Now, Duncan Scott knew, he was the treaty commissioner, he knew that there was no negotiation going to take place, because Ontario said if they didn't get everything they wanted, they didn't care what the First Nations did, they were just going to apply. So they were going in with the gun to the head to the First Nations. Now, it's interesting that when they landed in Fort Hope, where today we have the huge suicide epidemic, Chief Munias stood up and he said to the people, he said, wait a minute, the white guys aren't giving us money for nothing. If they're offering us money, they're taking something substantial away from us. That's what they were warning the people, and the commissioners had to give the people a story. They said that, no, you're going to get medical coverage. No, you're going to get schools. The issue of schooling was very important for people on the James Bay coast. The Cree communities knew that they needed education as a way to address the fact that their communities were in crisis. They knew the world was changing. And Mr. Speaker, Daniel McMartin's diary, which has only recently come to light, Daniel McMartin was with the commissioners as they went across Northern Ontario in 1905 and 1906. And Daniel McMartin said that the commissioners had to sweeten the deal verbally, but they didn't put any of it in writing. So what the people were told they were signing was a completely different thing than what they actually signed on to. So then, of course, later government said, hey, you surrendered the land. It's all there in black and white. It's all there on the page. But that wasn't the verbal commitment made. And Mr. Speaker, that has been the record of the so-called honor of the Crown for the following 100 years. I've seen it myself. I saw it in Barrier Lake, where the Liberal government signed an agreement with the community, and as soon as the agreement was signed, they walked away. I saw it in Kashechewan First Nation, where we sat down with the then Liberal government. We had an agreement to rebuild the community, and we sat down to look at the paper, to have the whole commitment that they had made verbally. And I remember saying to the chief, none of the promises are on the paper. And we were told, you can trust the honor of the Crown. Well, we know what happened to that. So much for the agreement with Kashechewan, but it took the present Conservative government to rip up that agreement. But that was the so-called honor of the Crown, and Daniel McMartin says that the people were misled. They had to mislead them in order to get them to sign off. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's fascinating and actually really deeply disturbing that it was Duncan Scott who led the Treaty 9 negotiations when the people who were coming to him said, okay, we understand our way of life is under threat. We will make an agreement if you promise that our children will get an education. Well, Duncan Scott had a plan for their education, all right. It was the residential schools. And what Duncan Scott said, that the residential schools had to be mandatory because it was to, quote, get rid of the Indian problem, to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed. This was about a genocidal policy. However you say it, it was about the destruction of the First Nation people, and they came into those communities and they misrepresented themselves, and they punished those communities with the residential schools, which nearly broke them. So 100 years later, Mr. Speaker, history's calling on us. It's knocking on the door of this House of Commons to say it is time to restore that broken relationship, to show that there is honor in the Crown, and to ensure that the First Nation people are treated with the rights and dignities that they have as the original First Nation people who never extinguished their rights in this country.